Let's focus on consumption, because that's something that the build up to the budget has seen a lot of conversation around. And I'm looking currently at private consumption expenditure, which has in financial year 24 grown only on a year-on-year basis by 4%. In FY22, it grew at 11.7%, also aided by a low base effect because it had gone into negative territory in financial year 21, but is currently growing at only 4%. If I look at FMCG sales, and we've seen a lot of companies in their investor calls, analyst calls, talk about how, especially in rural areas, they haven't seen as much consumption and demand as they would have expected. In financial year 23, food and agro-based product sales grew year-on-year only at 8.3%. In FY22, they grew at 21.2%. Subhash Garg, how much of a concern is this for budget makers at this moment? There's been a lot of talk during the election, the opposition's hitting on this, that there is rural distress, that there is income inequality, the rich are getting richer, the poorer don't have money to be able to spend. And how do you think the government and the finance minister could possibly attempt to fix this?
I think this is the biggest Achilles heel for the government. 5 years consumption growth is 4.5%, the Modi 2.2. And as you pointed out in the last year, 23-24 also, when the GDP was growing at 8.2%, the consumption was hardly 4% plus. This is a real concern. I think the government should recognize and go into the reasons why this is so.
What can the finance minister do?
That's a difficult call, but what you can do is, number one, spend more on improving the consumption of the poor. You do some schemes, if you can realign
like
them
what?
better. You do
more handouts. One of the ideas is increase
exactly.
Kisan Nidhi from 6,000 rupees to 8,000 rupees.
So that is one segment which is largely 75 to 80% of India's population, which is consuming less. Then middle class is also consuming less. It's investing in housing and others, but it's consuming relatively less because it has stress on the higher personal tax payments, etc. Can you put some little more money into the hands of the middle class?
Saurav, you had a cover story on the consumption conundrum. Briefly explain to our viewers tuning in right now what Business Today found in that cover story on how corporates had an empty basket and that consumption wasn't growing in the way that they would have thought, and what this reflects about the larger economy.
Yes, I think that's the key issue, like Mr. Garg said, which this budget will hope to address. Because the FMCG companies, just to take one element, you are seeing at the higher end, demand is all right. But at the lower end, at the middle end, there is definitely stress in terms of demand, which is why we call it a conundrum. While top end is working well, luxury cars, luxury housing and all of that, absolutely, there is stress at the bottom. What needs to be done really is to put more money in the hands of the middle class, and the rural, the distress has to be addressed.
But Siddharth, does the government acknowledge that there is a consumption issue? Because a lot of data points are being cited to suggest that no, rural consumption isn't down in the way that some of these economists and analysts are suggesting. And secondly, what do you think the government could do to boost consumption?
So, on the first part of your question, when we speak to people, policy makers, they point out that you have to discount 2.5 years of COVID from 2019 till 2024 and use that as a peg to say that something went different in the economy. Savings built up during the COVID period because most of us didn't have occasion and opportunity to spend. Once COVID got lifted, that money went out in droves. There was another, I would say, a sociological phenomenon where young people using technology said that a fixed deposit is far too boring for their interest. They instead went to mutual funds or direct equity investing, and within direct equity investing, Harsh made that point, went into the riskiest because their risk appetite is the most when you're 21, 22 years and making money initially. I think the consumption issue is also to be dealt with by recognizing the fact that prices have gone up. One of India's largest FMCG companies, Dabur, had to actually cut prices, and then its rural demand went up. Take Godrej, for example. I can go through a list of, and look at what has happened to prices across sectors. Saurav will bear me out on this. Automobiles. Average 40% increase over the past 2 years because input costs have gone up. China disruption. So if all of that is happening to corporates, wage growth has not gone up so much for the average person. And if net job creation at a higher consumption rate is not growing that fast, how will consumption happen? And therefore, to expect so much from the budget is perhaps wrong. And just one last point, Rajdeep. Are we therefore saying that should companies be forced to lower prices? Are we going back to a command control economy? No. So it's a very difficult point.
But we are now 3 years from COVID. You see, government policy makers have, you're right, suggested that those 2 years effectively changed people's sort of consumption, saving habits, affected people psychologically. But now 2 years on, you can't turn back and say what happened in 2020 to 2021 is reflecting in the slowdown in consumption. So now the government has to look ahead.
So Rajdeep, I started on your show today to say that what is most important is a 5-year roadmap, if not a 25-year roadmap, because you can't refer to the past to expand on present policy. Present policy requires future steps, and that is what is, I think, the most important part of the budget.
So in the interest of time, I don't want to get stuck on just one aspect of the budget. I want to move the needle now to investment. I want to take you through what the data is saying and then try and understand from our pundits of what can be done by the government. So here's gross fixed capital formation. How much money is being pumped into capital formation? So it's used as investment. Now this has been a flat line. If you see, in FY22 it was 33.4%. It stays relatively flat. In FY25 the forecast is 33.2%. Typically, when corporate taxes were reduced, the government would have expected that India Inc. will invest more in the India story. There are some signs of uptick, Rajiv Kumar, but not in the way policymakers would like. Now, through her conversations at different industry chambers, she's been nudging industry to invest more. That hasn't helped in the way the government would want, because once industry invests, jobs get created. In this budget, what do you think the government can do potentially to spur investment?
Investment is an aggregate demand problem. You've got to increase the aggregate demand in the economy for the capacity utilization to increase.
So I'll show that. Okay.
And therefore the investment will follow.
So
investment will not follow otherwise.
No, so I'll show the data for capacity utilization. I'm just trying to de-jargonize to the extent possible for our viewers. Now, what you're seeing here is capacity utilization of all the units of production. At what percentage do industry titans feel the need to start investing in fresh capacity? The general theory is when capacity utilization comes into the mid-70s, that is when industry starts investing in new production capacity. Now, the interesting thing here is capacity utilization has been in the mid-70s for a very long time. From March 22, if you look at where capacity utilization has been, it's been in the mid-70s. At December 23, it was 74.7%. So it's been said, yes.
Capacity utilization has to nudge 80% and above before investing.
So why is the needle not moving then?
The needle is not moving because the demand is not there. And the demand is not there because the consumption is not there. Consumption is not increasing because people's permanent income hypothesis, their expectation of continuity in their jobs is not there. So what you need to do is ultimately to crack the employment conundrum, not the consumption conundrum. Because the consumption
How do you crack the employment conundrum? That's much easier said than done, because there are other trends at play. Artificial intelligence, some of these service-type export jobs now being under threat and pressure. So how should the government deal with the employment conundrum?
An issue, especially I would say the last 18 months or so, has been a relative macro tightness. So for example, right now the RBI short-term rate is 650 basis points. Core inflation is 300 odd basis points. You know, the deflator in FY24 was 1% or so. It's just that the food price inflation are high, which is a large component of CPI, and the CPI, the way it is measured as on 2012 weights. The government has just announced in the economic survey, it will redo the CPI weights with the base year of 2024. And all surveys show that food consumption as a percentage of the average Indian's basket has gone down. So what is happening is we have old data. That old data is leading to policy making, whereas the deflator and the WPI itself will get converted into a PPI, what is known as a double deflator. Basically, we have a very high real inflation-adjusted interest rates in India, which was needed for FY23, but in FY24 it has been a bit overdone. Now maybe we don't say that openly, but we are basically waiting for the Fed to cut interest rates.
Even the member of the Monetary Policy Committee, Jayant Verma, has sort of said very clearly that we are now got...
Ashima Goyal as well. Two people dissented.
Have said that now we have very high real interest rates, when you deflate them by the real inflation. That's one policy issue that you can tackle. The other one is to somehow, and there are various measures to actually lower the real interest rate for the unorganized sector, which is still borrowing at 3% a month.
Yes.
And that has to be done.
In 2018, when
the Mudra loans were a point to it, but you have to go deeper into the Mudra loan and say what has happened to it. How much of it is gone? What is the unit size of that Mudra loan? Can it create capacity, or is it just used for working capital?
Just very quickly, in 2018, when CPI was actually very low and core CPI was high.
Once again, I must tell all our guests that when you say consumer price index, etc., please explain what you're trying to say, so we don't lose our viewers.
Okay, this is India Today, it's not Business Today, so let me just say that inflation was very low in 2018, then core inflation was high, the opposite of what is today.